It wasn't asked in public. There were no cameras, no reporters waiting outside. Yet the moment Prince George spoke, the air shifted. A child's voice, quiet but direct, cut through years of royal silence, and in that instant, Prince William froze. Not angry, not confused, just stunned, because the question wasn't innocent. It was precise, and it carried the unmistakable shadow of a woman the palace still struggles to speak about. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. What made the moment so unsettling was not where it happened, but how unguarded it was. This was not a ceremonial space shaped by tradition or protocol. There were no advisors lingering in doorways, no carefully rehearsed answers prepared in advance. This was a private exchange, father to son, stripped of titles and expectations. And yet, the weight that settled between them felt heavier than any public scandal William had ever faced. Prince George did not ask like a child testing boundaries. He asked like someone who had been thinking, observing, quietly assembling pieces that were never meant to fit together so soon. William's reaction was immediate and impossible to hide. His body stiffened, his expression faltered, and for a fleeting moment, the practiced composure of a future king vanished. Silence followed, not the polite silence of restraint, but the kind that arrives when the past rushes forward without warning. In that pause lived decades of unresolved grief, carefully managed narratives, and a lifetime spent learning how to survive under a crown that demands control above all else. The question had reached somewhere William rarely allowed himself to go. What unsettled him most was not the subject itself, but the awareness behind it. Prince George was not repeating something overheard in passing. There was intention in his tone, curiosity shaped by emotional understanding rather than childish imagination. It became instantly clear that this question had been forming for some time, fed by fragments, by half-truths, by the subtle tension that still surrounds one name in this family. Diana was not just a historical figure to George. She was a presence felt, sensed, and now spoken aloud. In that instant, William realized something he had long avoided confronting. Silence had not erased the past. It had sharpened it. By choosing caution over honesty, he had allowed mystery to grow where clarity might have softened the edges. Prince George was no longer standing at the edge of the family story, he was stepping directly into its most fragile chapter. And William, caught between being a protective father and the heir to an institution built on restraint, found himself unprepared for the cost of that moment. The question lingered even without an answer, pressing into the space between them, reshaping how William saw his son and himself. This was no longer about explaining history. It was about acknowledging inheritance, not of titles, but of pain, curiosity, and unfinished truth. And as the silence stretched on, William understood that something irreversible had already begun. But to understand why this single question landed like an emotional earthquake, we must go back to how Diana's story has always lived quietly, carefully inside William's home. In William's home, Diana was never erased, but she was never explained either. Her name existed in careful fragments. Stories softened. Details blurred. What was left unsaid mattered more than what was shared. William believed silence was protection, that by controlling the narrative he could shield his children from pain. But silence has a way of speaking louder over time, and Prince George had been listening. For William, restraint was not indifference. It was survival learned young. He had grown up under relentless attention, where grief became spectacle and vulnerability was dissected in headlines. Diana's absence had shaped him as deeply as her presence once did. And with that came an unshakable instinct to guard his children from the same exposure. He told himself that limiting the story meant limiting the hurt. That if Diana remained a softened memory rather than a fully formed truth, the sharpest edges of loss would never reach Prince George. Yet what William underestimated was how much weight a half-told story can carry. Inside that quiet household, Diana existed in pauses more than sentences. A name briefly mentioned and then redirected. A question gently deflected with a smile. A photograph acknowledged but never explained. William did not lie. He simply edited. And in those edits lived the echoes of his own childhood of being told to be strong, to move forward, to carry legacy without unpacking the cost. That generational trauma shaped his parenting in ways he rarely examined. He was determined to be present, loving, steady. But presence without honesty can still leave gaps, and those gaps have a way of inviting imagination. Prince George noticed what adults assumed he wouldn't. He felt the shift in tone when Diana's name surfaced. He sensed the careful balance his father maintained, the way certain conversations never reached a natural conclusion. George did not press immediately. He observed. He absorbed. Emotionally perceptive beyond his years, he began to recognize that some truths in his family were handled with extreme care. Not because they were unimportant, but because they were powerful. And power, when left unexplained, becomes magnetic. The absence of detail did not dull George's curiosity, it sharpened it. Silence became a puzzle, rather than a shield. The more William tried to preserve calm by withholding, the more space he created for questions to grow quietly. George began piecing together what he could from fragments, from subtle reactions, from history discussed elsewhere but never fully addressed at home, from the emotional undercurrent that lingered whenever Diana's legacy brushed too close to the present. What emerged was not confusion, but understanding shaped by intuition. William believed he was protecting his son from pain. But in doing so, he unknowingly invited a deeper reckoning. Because children do not simply inherit stories, they inherit the tension around them. And as the years passed, that tension became impossible for George to ignore. He was no longer just listening to silence. He was interpreting it, assembling meaning from what was missing, preparing questions that carried far more weight than William ever anticipated. And as the silence stretched on, something unexpected began to happen. Prince George started forming his own questions. Children notice what adults assume they won't. A photograph paused on too long. A name avoided mid-sentence. A reaction that arrives a second too late. Prince George began connecting dots no one realized were visible. And slowly, a pattern emerged, one that didn't match the fairy tale version of royal history he was meant to inherit. It began quietly, almost invisibly, in the small spaces between conversations. George noticed how certain stories about the past were told with confidence, while others dissolved into vagueness. He sensed when answers arrived polished and complete, and when they arrived softened, redirected, or cut short. There were moments when curiosity brushed against a boundary and was gently pushed away, not with anger, but with caution. That caution lingered. It suggested there was something beneath the surface worth protecting or avoiding. Fragments reached him from unexpected places. A passage in a book that hinted at turmoil rather than triumph. A media clip glimpsed briefly before an adult changed the subject. A conversation overheard from another room, voices lowered not out of secrecy, but habit. None of it was explicit. None of it needed to be. Prince George's understanding grew not from a single revelation, but from accumulation. Each fragment added weight, and together they formed a quiet contradiction to the simplified narrative he was given. What made this unsettling was not the information itself, but George's ability to interpret it. He did not absorb these moments passively. He processed them. He compared what he saw with what he was told. Emotionally intuitive, he sensed when discomfort entered the room, when a name carried more meaning than its syllables suggested. While others assumed innocence, George demonstrated perception. He began to understand that authority does not always come with transparency, and that truth, especially in his family, often arrives in controlled portions. The tension between what George knew and what he was told became its own lesson. Each time a story felt incomplete, his curiosity sharpened. Each time an explanation felt rehearsed, he noticed the difference. This was not rebellion. It was awareness. A quiet, internal questioning that did not yet seek confrontation, but demanded coherence. And as those questions formed, they did not drift toward strangers or teachers. They stayed close to home, aimed inward, toward the one person George trusted to answer honestly. There was a subtle shift in how he listened. Less passive, more deliberate. He paid attention to pauses as much as words, to expressions as much as explanations. Authority no longer felt absolute, it felt human, fallible, and that realization carried power. Because once a child recognizes that truth can be managed, curiosity stops being harmless. It becomes purposeful. Prince George was no longer absorbing history, he was interrogating it. By then, the pattern was clear to him, even if it remained unspoken. The story he inherited was incomplete, and the gaps mattered. They pointed toward a truth that had been softened for survival. And as that understanding settled, curiosity shifted into something heavier, something that pressed against silence rather than resting inside it. Eventually, curiosity became something heavier, something that demanded an answer. The question didn't come with hesitation. No stutter. No nervous glance. Prince George looked directly at his father and said her name Diana with clarity and intent. What followed wasn't an argument. It wasn't denial. It was silence. The kind of silence that only appears when truth arrives uninvited. The moment stretched longer than it should have. Not because William refused to respond, but because he couldn't. The name landed with precision, carrying none of the softness William had carefully wrapped around it for years. George did not say it as history. He said it as presence, as something alive between them. The wording was deliberate, shaped by thought rather than impulse, and that was what struck William hardest. This was not a child testing a forbidden subject. This was a son asking for alignment between what he felt and what he had been told. William's mind raced, but his body betrayed him first. A pause too long. A breath caught halfway. In that instant, decades collapsed inward. Diana was no longer a memory managed by time and duty. She was a force re-entering his life through the eyes of his child. The question reframed everything. It wasn't about tragedy alone, or legacy, or even loss. It was about truth. About whether the story William had constructed could survive being questioned by someone who trusted him completely. The specificity of George's words made escape impossible. There was no room for generalities, no safe abstraction to retreat into. Diana was named directly, without ceremony, without reverence, without fear. And in that naming came a challenge William had never faced in public life. The world had demanded statements. The crown had demanded composure. But George demanded honesty. Fatherhood demanded presence. And the two collided violently inside him. Royal conditioning urged restraint. Years of training whispered that certain doors, once opened, never close cleanly again. That some truths destabilize more than they heal. But the man beneath the title felt something else rising, an ache sharpened by recognition. He saw in his son the same searching gaze he once carried. The same quiet hunger for understanding that had followed him since childhood. In that moment, William understood that shielding George from Diana's complexity might cost him something far greater than pain. It might cost him trust. The silence deepened, heavy with everything left unsaid. George did not press. He did not repeat the question. He watched, and that watching mattered. Because children learn not only from answers, but from reactions. George saw the conflict play across his father's face, the pull between legacy and love, between protection and truth. He saw that this question had reached somewhere raw and unresolved. And once seen, it could not be unseen. This was the turning point. Not because words were spoken, but because they weren't. The absence of an answer became its own revelation. Diana's legacy shifted in that pause, no longer confined to memory or myth, but alive in the tension between a father and a son. The past had breached the present, and William knew that whatever came next would redefine more than a conversation. It would redefine how he showed up as a father, and how his son understood the weight of inheritance. Because the question wasn't just about Diana, it was about William himself. Prince William has faced the world's cameras during moments of grief, fury, and heartbreak. Yet this question asked by his own son left him unarmed, because answering meant revisiting choices he made long ago. Choices about silence, about control, about whether shielding the truth had quietly become another kind of betrayal. Inside William, the conflict was immediate and merciless. Part of him wanted to respond as a father, instinctively, honestly, without filters or caution. But another part, the part shaped by duty, expectation, and the weight of an institution older than emotion, pulled him back. He had spent his life learning how to contain pain, how to survive scrutiny by mastering restraint. That discipline had protected him in public life. Now it was betraying him in private. Because fatherhood does not reward control the way the crown does. The fear that surfaced was not abstract. It was deeply personal. William remembered what it felt like to grow up amid unfinished conversations and public mourning, to inherit trauma before he could understand it. He had promised himself his children would not carry the same burden. Yet here he was, facing proof that silence had not erased that inheritance, it had simply delayed it. The question forced him to confront a terrifying possibility, that in trying to avoid repeating the monarchy's mistakes, he might be recreating them in another form. Diana's grief lived inside him still, unresolved and carefully managed. He had learned how to honor her publicly while containing her privately, how to speak her name without opening old wounds. But George's question pierced that balance. It did not ask for ceremony or tribute. It asked for truth. And truth, once invited, demands courage. William felt the past pressing down, reminding him that unfinished grief does not disappear, it waits. The legacy he carried was no longer just his to manage. It was becoming his son's to question. In that moment, William's certainty as a parent cracked. He had always believed love and stability would be enough. That presence could compensate for what was left unsaid. But standing there, unable to answer, he felt the limits of that belief. Authority offered no shelter. Experience provided no script. The role he understood best suddenly felt inadequate. He was not being tested as a prince or a future king. He was being tested as a father, and the stakes felt unbearable. The burden of legacy loomed larger than ever. William understood that whatever he chose next, speech or silence, would shape how George learned to approach truth. An answer might open wounds he had spent years containing. But refusing to answer risked teaching his son that some questions are too dangerous to ask, even within family. That realization carried consequences far beyond this moment. It suggested a future where distance could replace trust, where curiosity might turn into quiet resentment. William hesitated, and that hesitation became its own decision. Not final, but revealing. It exposed the fault line between protection and honesty, between love and fear. The longer the silence held, the clearer it became that this was not a pause without cost. Something was already shifting, subtly but permanently, in the space between them. And in that hesitation, Prince George noticed something even more powerful than words. Prince George didn't need an answer. His father's expression said everything. In that moment, George saw vulnerability, not authority. Pain, not power. And once a child sees that, nothing feels quite the same again. The silence did not confuse him, it clarified. George recognized the weight behind his father's stillness, the kind that does not come from uncertainty, but from knowing too much at once. He understood, instinctively, that he had touched something fragile. The realization settled slowly, reshaping how he perceived the man in front of him. William was no longer just a figure of reassurance and certainty. He was human, carrying grief, carrying history, carrying something unfinished that could not be smoothed away with comforting words. That shift mattered, because when a child sees vulnerability where strength once stood unchallenged, it changes the architecture of trust. George did not feel fear. He felt awareness. He began to understand that the monarchy he was born into was not built solely on tradition and continuity, but on emotional compromises passed quietly from one generation to the next. The crown, once imagined as solid and immovable, now appeared layered, held together by restraint as much as ceremony. This moment marked the passing of something intangible but profound: generational awareness. George sensed that his father's silence was inherited, learned, shaped by forces far older than either of them. He saw how pain could be managed rather than healed, how distance could masquerade as protection. And in recognizing that pattern, he became part of it, not as a passive recipient, but as a witness. That awareness would stay with him, influencing how he listened, how he questioned, how he interpreted the world that awaited him. There was a cost to this clarity. Emotional distance, once invisible, became perceptible. George felt the gap between what could be said and what was left untouched. He did not resent it, but he registered it. And registration is the first step toward reckoning. The monarchy, as he now glimpsed it, was not just a system of titles and expectations. It was a family shaped by silence. And silence, once noticed, cannot be unnoticed. Long-term implications began to form quietly within him. Identity, still developing, took on complexity earlier than expected. George was no longer only the future. He was a bridge between past and possibility. He would carry not just a name, but the awareness of what that name concealed. That awareness hinted at future tension, not dramatic rebellion, but thoughtful resistance. A determination to understand before accepting, to ask before inheriting. William, watching his son absorb this moment, may not have realized how deeply it would resonate. But George did. He felt the shift as something irreversible, a subtle recalibration of how he would approach truth and authority from that day forward. The silence had spoken, and its message was heavier than words. It suggested that some legacies are defined not by what is taught, but by what is withheld. What followed was not an argument, but a quiet reckoning. No promises were made, no explanations offered. Yet something changed. An understanding formed in the space between them, fragile, unspoken, and impossible to undo. The past had entered the room, and it wasn't leaving quietly. The aftermath settled slowly, like weight rather than noise. There was no dramatic fallout, no raised voices or sudden declarations. Instead, the shift revealed itself in subtleties. Conversations carried a different caution. Pauses lingered longer than before. What had once felt like protective silence now felt exposed, as though its purpose had been quietly questioned. William sensed it immediately. He had not answered his son, but he had revealed himself, and that revelation could not be contained. Within the family, dynamics adjusted almost imperceptibly. William became more reflective, more deliberate in moments that once required no thought. He found himself listening differently, aware that George was no longer simply absorbing the world around him, but interpreting it. Authority no longer rested solely in position. It was being evaluated through honesty. That realization unsettled William, not because he feared his son's independence, but because he understood how quickly distance can grow when truth is delayed. Inside William, something hardened into resolve, not defensive, but determined. He began to recognize that silence, once chosen as a shield, had limits. It could no longer be his default. The encounter forced him to reconsider the cost of emotional restraint, to confront whether maintaining control had come at the expense of connection. This was not a sudden transformation, but the beginning of one. A recalibration shaped by the understanding that legacy is not preserved through omission, but through trust. For Prince George, independence arrived quietly but unmistakably. He did not push for answers, but he adjusted his posture within the family. He listened more carefully. He asked questions with intention, not impulsiveness. The moment had taught him that truth could be complicated, that adults carry contradictions, and that authority does not always equate to certainty. That awareness gave him a sense of agency he had not possessed before. He was no longer just the future inheriting a story, he was an active participant in how that story might be told. The weight of inherited truth pressed in from both directions. William felt it as responsibility sharpened by regret. George felt it as awareness sharpened by curiosity. Neither spoke it aloud, but both understood that something essential had shifted. The past was no longer contained within memory or ceremony. It had moved into the present, demanding reckoning rather than reverence. And once that demand is felt, it cannot be ignored without consequence. This quiet reckoning did not resolve anything. It rearranged priorities. It planted seeds that would grow in unexpected ways. William knew that future conversations would carry the imprint of this moment, that trust would require courage rather than caution. George sensed that unanswered questions carry their own gravity, shaping decisions long after the moment has passed. Nothing outwardly changed, yet everything beneath the surface had. The understanding between them, unspoken and fragile, became part of the family's emotional fabric. It would influence how stories were told, how silence was weighed, how truth would eventually be approached. And while this moment ended without resolution, it set something in motion that neither father nor son could fully control. But the palace has never survived unanswered questions without consequence. One child's question may seem harmless, But within the monarchy, it's a warning. Because when heirs begin questioning the past, the future becomes unpredictable. And Prince George has just opened a door the palace spent decades sealing shut. Institutions survive on control of narrative, and the monarchy is no exception. Stories are curated, pain is softened, and certain chapters are kept deliberately distant to preserve continuity. What unsettles the palace is not curiosity itself, but where that curiosity is aimed. Diana remains an unresolved symbol of vulnerability, defiance, and a version of royalty that challenged silence rather than mastered it. Her presence in the public imagination has never been fully reconciled, only managed. And now, through George, that presence is pressing forward again, unfiltered and uncontained. The fear is structural. When an heir begins to question what has been withheld, the carefully maintained balance between tradition and truth starts to strain. This is not about one conversation between father and son. It is about what happens when the next generation refuses to inherit silence without scrutiny. The palace understands that unanswered questions do not fade, they multiply. And once those questions belong to a future king, they carry consequences far beyond private family dynamics. Diana's symbolism complicates everything. She represents empathy over protocol, exposure over concealment, and emotional honesty in a system built to discourage it. Her story was never neatly resolved, only redirected. George's curiosity threatens to pull that story back into the present, not as nostalgia but as reckoning. The institution knows that reopening that chapter risks reigniting debates it has worked tirelessly to quiet. Debates about transparency, about accountability, about whether tradition should evolve or entrench. This sets the stage for an inevitable clash between truth and tradition. George is emerging as a different kind of heir, not louder, not rebellious, but perceptive. His strength lies in awareness, not defiance. That subtlety is what makes him unpredictable. He does not challenge authority outright, he questions its foundations. And institutions fear questions they cannot easily dismiss, because answers, once demanded, must eventually be given or resisted at a cost. The stakes escalate quickly. What begins as a private moment now reverberates through the monarchy's future. Advisors, protocols, and unspoken rules all exist to prevent precisely this kind of destabilization. Yet destabilization does not always arrive with scandal. Sometimes it arrives quietly, through a child who notices inconsistencies and refuses to accept incomplete explanations. George's question has introduced uncertainty into a system that depends on predictability. This is where the danger lies. Not in what George asked, but in what he represents. A generation shaped by legacy but unwilling to be confined by it. A future king who may seek coherence rather than compliance. The palace understands that managing public perception is one challenge. Managing internal transformation is another entirely. And the latter cannot be handled with press statements or controlled appearances. As this realization settles, it becomes clear that the monarchy is standing at the edge of something it cannot fully command. The question has already done its work. It has exposed vulnerabilities, unsettled assumptions, and hinted at a future where silence may no longer be the safest option. The institution can attempt to close ranks, but the door has already been opened, and what lies beyond it is no longer fully within their control. And as the weight of that realization settles, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. Prince William found his voice again, but the moment had already passed. Because some questions don't demand answers, they demand change. And from that day forward, Diana was no longer just a memory in the palace. She was a conversation waiting to happen. In the days that followed, the silence no longer felt like absence. It felt like pressure. William carried the weight of that moment with him, aware that something subtle, yet permanent had shifted. The question had not exposed a scandal or forced a confession, but it had unsettled the foundation on which certainty once stood. Legacy, he realized, was not only about what is preserved, but about what is finally acknowledged. And acknowledgement has consequences that cannot be managed with restraint alone. The long-term impact of that exchange did not announce itself loudly. It unfolded quietly, reshaping priorities and recalibrating intentions. William began to understand that honesty delayed is not neutrality, it is a choice that shapes the future. Diana's story, once carefully contained, now demanded reconsideration, not as tragedy alone, but as truth. The realization was haunting. It suggested that shielding the next generation from pain might also shield them from understanding, and that understanding is the only inheritance capable of evolving. Prince George, unknowingly, had become a catalyst, not through defiance, but through clarity. His question reframed the path forward, suggesting that the future of the monarchy may depend less on tradition and more on emotional courage. George represented a shift away from unquestioned inheritance toward conscious acceptance. Titles could be passed down, but emotional truth had to be earned. And that truth, once awakened, would not return quietly to the shadows. This moment highlighted a deeper reality, that emotional inheritance often outweighs ceremonial legacy. The crown carries history, but families carry memory. What George absorbed was not protocol, but awareness. He learned that strength can coexist with vulnerability, that leadership can begin with listening, and that silence, while powerful, is never neutral. These lessons would shape him long before responsibility formally arrived. For the audience watching from afar, the unease lingers. This was not resolution, it was revelation. The story does not end with certainty or closure, but with anticipation. The question opened a door that leads forward, not backward, toward a monarchy forced to reconcile truth with continuity. Diana's presence now lives not only in memory, but in momentum, in the quiet insistence that the past must be understood to guide the future. Because this wasn't the end of a conversation, it was the beginning of one the monarchy can no longer control. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.